Hey guys, tonight we're diving into 4 bizarre corners of history, split into 12 relaxing parts. 5 on what happened to royal mistresses when kings got bored. 2 on how medieval people went to the toilet. 2 on the strangest ways people tried to cheat death. And 3 on what happened to executioners after they retired. So dim the lights, get comfy, and let these slow, weirdly fascinating stories gently drift you into history, and maybe even sleep. Part 1. What happened to royal mistresses when kings got bored of them? Hey guys. Tonight we're settling in with a story that has everything you'd expect from European royalty. Silks, scandal, and an endless parade of mistresses who, more often than not, learned the hard way that being the favorite woman of a king was not the permanent career path they hoped it might be. So dim the lights, sink back into your pillow, and let's drift into a world where love affairs turned into banishments, convents, or sometimes very comfortable retirements. Now, royal mistresses have always been a sort of historical open secret. Everyone knew they existed. Everyone knew the king had them. Courtiers had to bow to them. Poets praised their eyes. Painters immortalized them in oils. And the queen, well, the queen just had to put up with it. Because as long as there's been monarchy, there's been the quiet little arrangement of official mistress. And of course, there's the catch. Mistresses were only official as long as they kept the king entertained. And kings, as we know, had the attention spans of spoiled children in a candy shop. Sooner or later, the glitter wore off, and the poor woman had to find out what happens when the king simply gets bored. Let's start in France, because, of course, France. If you're thinking mistresses, France practically industrialized the concept. They didn't just have mistresses. They had maîtresse en titre, an official title, like the CEO of being the king's girlfriend. Versailles ran on gossip about who held the role, who wanted it, and who had just been tossed aside with a polite merci, but no merci. One of the most famous stories is of Louise de la Vallière, mistress to King Louis XIV, the Sun King himself. Louise was young, sweet, and apparently quite shy. She actually felt guilty about her affair with the king, which in court society was about as useful as bringing a Bible to a gambling hall. Louis paraded her around, then eventually got bored, as one does when you're busy building Versailles and declaring yourself the human embodiment of the sun. What happened to Louise? Well, she was pushed gently but firmly into retirement. And by retirement, I mean she was sent to a convent, where she lived out the rest of her days in quiet repentance. Imagine being at the center of the most glamorous court in Europe, and then suddenly you're stuck praying in silence all day. That's one way to crash from royal mistress to nun number 42. Of course, not every mistress got the convent ending. Some did much better. Take Madame de Pompadour, for example, also a mistress of Louis XIV. She managed to stay in the king's favor long after their romantic relationship fizzled out. She was clever, witty, and, crucially, she knew how to manage a palace full of ambitious courtiers. When Louis got bored of the romance part, Pompadour simply reinvented herself as his best friend and political advisor. She ended up with power, influence, and a legacy that still fascinates historians, which just goes to show being a mistress wasn't always about looks. It was about strategy. But for every Pompadour, there were a dozen Louises. The discarded mistresses often got shuffled into one of 3 fates. 1, married off to some loyal noble, like a regifted present no one really wanted. 2, shoved into a convent, as though praying really hard could erase years of royal scandal. 3rd, or left, with a generous pension and a country estate. Basically, hush money with nice curtains. And the humiliation could be brutal. For example, when a mistress fell out of favor, the courtiers who once fawned over her would turn on a dime. Yesterday they bowed low. Today, they pretend not to see her. Social death was almost worse than the convent. Let's float across the channel to England, because of course the Tudors can't resist joining the drama. Henry VIII's mistresses are, well, a category of their own. We usually focus on his 6 wives, but Henry had a pretty busy extracurricular schedule too. One of his early favorites was Elizabeth Blount, known as Bessie. She was charming enough to produce Henry's only acknowledged illegitimate child, Henry Fitzroy. And what happened to Bessie once the king moved on? She was quickly married off to a loyal courtier, which was the Tudor version of saying, "Thanks for your service, please enjoy your consolation, husband." Anne Boleyn herself started in that sort of ambiguous mistress role. Though she played it much smarter, she refused to be simply a fling. She maneuvered, she held back, she demanded, and we all know how that ended. Anne became queen, briefly, before Henry got bored, paranoid, and sent her to the chopping block. Which honestly was an even worse retirement package than a convent. England, though, tended not to institutionalize mistresses the way France did. Instead, it was more of a hush-hush, wink-nudge system. The Queen had to deal with it, the court gossiped about it, and the woman herself just had to pray she got a pension, or at least some nice jewelry, out of the arrangement. One of the most notorious examples comes later with Charles II, the Merry Monarch. He had an almost comical list of mistresses, actresses, aristocrats, anyone who caught his eye. Some got titles, some got houses, and some just faded into obscurity when the king moved on. Nell Gwyn, the famous actress, managed to keep her sense of humor through it all. When people sneered at her as the Protestant whore, because yes, even mistresses had denominational labels in those days, she famously quipped that at least she wasn't the Catholic one. Charles, at least, tended to pension them off generously. He liked his women, but he wasn't cruel about the discards. Meanwhile, in Spain, mistresses had a harder time. The Catholic monarchs frowned on flaunting affairs the way the French did. But even so, kings had them, and when they were done, the women usually vanished into quiet obscurity. No Versailles glitter, no Pompadour-style political clout. Just silence. And let's not forget the psychological cost. Being a royal mistress was basically living on a countdown clock. Every day you wondered, is this the day he gets bored? Is this the day someone younger, prettier, or just less annoying replaces me? Imagine sleeping every night in silk sheets while also knowing that any moment it could all vanish, and tomorrow you'd be eating thin soup in a convent. It was the ultimate high-risk, high-reward career. But we're only scratching the surface here. Because once kings across Europe got bored of their lovers, what happened next could get very creative. Some mistresses ended up wielding power. Some reinvented themselves as cultural icons. And some, well, let's just say, they didn't exactly land on their feet. So let's gently float to another example. The glittering yet tragic carousel of Louis XV's endless parade of women. Part 3. The Russian way of discarding lovers now. If France turned Mistresses into a public spectacle, and England preferred the quiet pension and countryside cottage method, Russia did things in a much more volatile way, because Russia never really did anything halfway. Let's start with Peter the Great. Peter was famous for dragging Russia, kicking and screaming, into the modern era. But in his personal life, he was just as chaotic as you'd expect. He had mistresses throughout his reign, though the concept of an official mistress wasn't quite the same as in France. Still, when Peter was bored, the solution was simple: exile. The poor woman was sent away, usually without much warning, sometimes to a convent, sometimes to a remote estate, always somewhere cold and very far from the capital. Russia's version of breaking up was essentially, pack your furs. You're going to Siberia. But the real twist in Russia was the power of empresses. Once women sat on the throne, they became the ones with long lists of lovers. And if kings were fickle, queens could be downright ruthless. Take Catherine the Great. She is remembered for ruling Russia with intelligence, ambition, and yes, for her famously colorful love life. Catherine had a series of lovers throughout her reign, often younger men chosen carefully for their looks, loyalty, and usefulness. And what happened when she grew tired of them? Well, Catherine had a system. She would give her discarded lovers generous pensions, country estates, and even government positions. Basically, the thank you for your service. Please enjoy your estate and do not cause trouble package. One famous example was Grigory Orlov, who helped Catherine seize power in her coup against her husband, Peter III. He was her partner for years, but eventually she moved on. Rather than humiliating him, she gave him honors and estates. He retired wealthy, though somewhat bitter. Catherine knew better than to create angry ex-lovers in a court full of daggers. But not all her discarded men were so lucky. Some were quietly sidelined, their influence stripped away, left to wander around their estates remembering the good old days. Others simply faded into history, footnotes in a long list of Catherine's favorites. It was the Russian version of a retirement plan. Comfortable, but painfully irrelevant. The Russian system shows us an interesting inversion. While in France and England, women had to fear the king's boredom. In Russia, it was often the men who nervously wondered how long they had before the empress replaced them. Imagine being 22, beautiful, and adored by Catherine the Great. And then 5 years later, you're 30 and considered practically ancient. Your reward? A pension and a house. Better than a convent, but not exactly glamorous. This pattern wasn't unique to Catherine. Later empresses followed similar habits. Mistresses, or in this case, male favorites, were treated as temporary companions, cycled in and out of power with alarming speed. And when the passion ended, the generosity varied. Sometimes they were showered with wealth, sometimes they were simply erased. And then there was the gossip. In Russia, discarded lovers weren't just forgotten. They were whispered about. Rumors spread that Catherine had grown tired of one man because he bored her at dinner, or because his manners weren't refined enough, or because he gained weight. Whether true or not, the gossip itself became part of the humiliation, being remembered not as a statesman or hero, but as that ex-lover Catherine didn't like anymore, was in some ways the cruelest fate of all. Let's float gently back west, because this wasn't just a Russian quirk. Across Europe, the fate of mistresses, whether queen's favorites or kings, always reflected the same rule. Once you were no longer useful, you were disposable. Kings could shower a woman with diamonds one month, and the next month she was begging for a pension. Empresses could dote on a handsome young officer, then quietly replace him as soon as he wrinkled around the eyes. It's not a coincidence that so many discarded lovers turned to religion later in life. Convents, monasteries, pilgrimages, they became the fallback option for people who had flown too close to the royal sun and been burned. It was easier to explain a fall from grace as a spiritual awakening than to admit the obvious truth. The monarch had simply gotten bored. Still, there's something almost tragic about it. These were people who lived in a kind of artificial spotlight, adored by the most powerful rulers on earth, only to vanish into silence. Some went mad, some died in obscurity, and some, very few, managed to reinvent themselves and keep their dignity. Now, speaking of tragic, let's drift over to Spain and Portugal, where Catholic monarchs had a very particular way of handling the problem of what to do with the mistress. Part 4. Catholic crowns and quiet endings. Spain and Portugal had monarchies that were deeply Catholic, very image-conscious, and publicly much less eager to flaunt their mistresses than, say, the French Bourbons. But of course, that doesn't mean they didn't have them. They simply wrapped the whole business in layers of secrecy, denials, and whispers that everyone pretended not to hear. Let's start with Spain. Spanish kings were supposed to be paragons of Catholic virtue, upholding the church, fighting heresy, and generally being the most devout rulers in Europe. Which is exactly why the subject of mistresses became so delicate. Officially, Spanish monarchs didn't parade their lovers around the court. Unofficially, they had them, often in significant numbers. Take Philip IV of Spain. On paper, he was a serious, devout monarch. In reality, he had around 30 children outside of his marriage. 30. At that point, it's less of a royal bloodline and more of a small village. And what happened to the women involved? Well, unlike France, where mistresses might be elevated with titles and apartments, in Spain, they tended to vanish once the king moved on. They were paid off quietly, shuffled into minor marriages, or simply ignored. The Spanish court didn't want scandals. It wanted silence. For the women, this meant no glittering legacy, no Pompadour-style influence. Being a mistress in Spain was less about dazzling society and more about being discreet. And when the king got bored, the outcome was usually some version of exile into obscurity. Many ended up in convents. Spain, after all, was full of monasteries and cloisters ready to swallow up inconvenient women. It was the safest way to erase their presence without too much gossip. Portugal followed a similar pattern. Mistresses existed, sometimes acknowledged, often not. A king might reward a favorite with estates or gifts, but when the affair ended, the silence was almost absolute. The church loomed too large in Iberian politics for mistresses to enjoy the kind of public power seen in France or even England. If you were a mistress to a Portuguese king, you might live well for a while. But once you were dismissed, you were gone. No fanfare, no portraits, no witty salons. Just a quiet fade into anonymity. And yet even in these stricter Catholic courts, patterns emerged. Some women managed to negotiate a sort of semi-retirement by having children with the king. Illegitimate children, if acknowledged, could secure pensions for their mothers. For example, Philip IV's son, Don Juan of Austria the Younger, became an important military commander. His mother, though not a queen, at least gained lasting recognition because of her son's career. It was a kind of indirect retirement package. Raise the royal bastard, and you might just avoid being forgotten completely. Still, the overall atmosphere in Spain and Portugal was far less glamorous than France. Mistresses there weren't stars, they were shadows, and when the monarch grew tired, those shadows were very easily erased. Now, this contrast is fascinating because it shows how much the public image of monarchy mattered. In France, flaunting a mistress was practically part of the job description. In England, it was tolerated as long as nobody pushed it too far. In Spain and Portugal, it was an embarrassment to be covered up. And in Russia, it depended on whether the ruler was a man or a woman. The mistress, or favorite, was always at the mercy of the crown's mood and the country's culture. Let's float gently now toward a different angle. Because while kings were discarding mistresses left and right, queens were sometimes doing the very same thing with their lovers. And nowhere is that clearer than in the courts of Italy and later France, where queens occasionally took matters into their own hands. Part 5. When queens played the same game so far, most of our sleepy wander has been about kings and their mistresses. But of course, history has a way of balancing things out. Because queens and powerful noblewomen often had lovers of their own, they just had to be more careful about it, since adultery for a queen carried much steeper risks than for a king. A king's affair was a scandal. A queen's affair could be treason. But that didn't stop some of them, and the way queens handled their lovers, once bored, could be just as fascinating, sometimes generous, sometimes brutal. Let's begin in Italy, because Renaissance courts were practically laboratories for intrigue. The Medici women, for example, knew how to wield lovers strategically. Catherine de' Medici, who became Queen of France, wasn't particularly scandalous herself. But her court was a hotbed of gossip, with ladies-in-waiting often encouraged to distract powerful men. Catherine understood that mistresses could be political tools, but once those tools weren't useful, they were dismissed. And dismissed in the Renaissance often meant married off quickly, shipped to a convent, or quietly poisoned if they caused too much trouble. Romantic, right? Moving into France again. One of the most famous cases of a queen with her own alleged lovers is Marie Antoinette. Now, historians still debate how much truth there was to the rumors. But Versailles buzzed constantly with whispers that Marie Antoinette had favorites among her close male friends, particularly Count Axel von Fersen. Whether or not anything happened between them, the gossip alone was damaging. And it raises an interesting question. What would have happened if she had gotten bored of such a lover? Well, in Marie Antoinette's case, boredom wasn't the issue. Revolution was. She didn't live long enough to retire anyone gracefully. But there are other examples. Take Christina of Sweden, the eccentric queen who abdicated her throne in the 17th century. Christina had a reputation for keeping favorites, both male and female, and then discarding them just as quickly. She was moody, unpredictable, and when she tired of someone, she simply cut them off. One day, you were the queen's closest confidant. The next, you were exiled from her court, your name barely mentioned again. In her world, dismissal meant social death, which, for an ambitious courtier, could feel worse than exile. And then there's Catherine the Great again, because we can't resist circling back to her. Catherine's lovers, as we've said, were often rewarded when dismissed, but there were exceptions. If a lover annoyed her, or worse, betrayed her, he could be punished harshly. Some were sent away in disgrace, their pensions reduced, their reputations shredded by gossip. Catherine was pragmatic. She didn't like living loose ends. The contrast here is striking. Kings could discard mistresses with relative ease because society assumed mistresses were replaceable. But queens, when they cast off a lover, were often judged much more harshly. A dismissed male favorite could become a dangerous political rival, or at least a thorn in the side of the queen's image, which is why queens often made sure their former lovers were comfortably retired or thoroughly destroyed. One of the most dramatic examples of this comes from England again. Elizabeth I, the so-called Virgin Queen, never married, but she certainly had favorites. Robert Dudley, the Earl of Leicester, was her closest companion for decades. She never officially made him a lover, but everyone at court suspected. When Elizabeth tired of a favorite, she had her own elegant way of dismissing them. She would simply withdraw her favor. No more invitations, no more glances across the chamber, no more private conversations. The man would suddenly find himself standing on the edge of the court, invisible, as new favorites took his place. For ambitious nobles, this was devastating. Imagine building your entire career on a queen's smile, only to realize she'd turned it off like a candle. Some of Elizabeth's favorites managed to retire with titles and estates. Others, like the Earl of Essex, pushed too far and ended up executed for treason. Being close to a queen was always dangerous, because when the relationship soured, the fall could be steep. It's interesting to notice how gender shaped the outcomes. For a royal mistress, being discarded often meant humiliation, obscurity, or a convent. For a male favorite of a queen, being discarded could mean losing a fortune, or losing your head. And yet in every court, the pattern holds. Royal affection was temporary. Whether you were the king's mistress or the queen's lover, your days were numbered. The only real question was how gracefully or disastrously the ending would play out. Now, having wandered through queens and their discarded men, let's slowly drift back to the broader picture again. Because across Europe, from Versailles to Madrid to St. Petersburg, one truth remained. The lives of royal mistresses, and lovers in general, were defined by their endings. The glittering entrance was always dramatic. But the exit? The exit was where the real stories began. Let's float onward now, toward the later centuries, where the role of the mistress began to change with society itself. The 18th and 19th centuries brought revolutions, Enlightenment ideals, and shifting morals. And with those changes came new fates for discarded lovers. Part 1. The strangest ways people tried to cheat death in history. Hey guys, tonight we begin with something a little bit odd. Well, odd in the way most of human history is odd. People have always hated the idea of dying, understandably, and for thousands of years, rather than just accepting the inevitable like a stoic philosopher with a bad haircut. Humans have come up with the most bizarre, uncomfortable, and sometimes downright tragic ways of trying to stretch their lifespans. Now, you might expect this story to be about medical breakthroughs or genius doctors ahead of their time. But no, tonight is about the stranger side of things. The magical potions, the bad science, the royal tantrums, and the rich aristocrats who thought they could just buy their way out of mortality. Spoiler, they couldn't, but they sure tried. So fluff your pillow, take a slow breath, and let's drift back to a world where alchemists promised immortality, monarchs drank strange potions, and emperors thought bathing in blood was a legitimate wellness routine. Because, of course, they did. Let's begin in ancient China, because if there was ever a civilization that took cheating death to industrial levels, it was Imperial China. The emperors there, especially during the Qin and Han dynasties, were famously obsessed with immortality. The most notorious was Qin Shi Huang, the guy who built the first version of the Great Wall, standardized weights and measures, and had an ego so enormous he also commissioned the Terracotta Army to guard him in the afterlife. But Qin Shi Huang wasn't content with an army of statues. He wanted to live forever, so he consulted alchemists who promised him the elixir of life, which sounds nice until you learn that the main ingredient was mercury. Yes, actual mercury, shiny, liquid metal. The stuff we now know is wildly toxic. The emperor drank it in increasing doses, thinking it would purify his body and grant eternal life. Instead, he died at 49 of mercury poisoning. His courtiers were apparently so panicked about his death that they disguised the smell of his rotting body on a procession back to the capital by loading carts of fish around his coffin. Nothing says eternal life quite like cover him with tuna. This was not an isolated case. Chinese records are full of emperors and aristocrats swallowing concoctions of mercury, arsenic, and various minerals. The idea was that these substances were indestructible, so by ingesting them, your body would become indestructible too. Unfortunately, what actually happened was organ failure. But at least the logic was creative. Now let's float westward for a moment. To ancient Rome. Romans were not shy about embracing excess when it came to health. They didn't really chase immortality the same way the Chinese did, but they absolutely wanted to live longer, healthier, and preferably more glamorous lives. One Roman emperor, Marcus Aurelius, the so-called philosopher king, famously dosed himself with a daily medicine called theriac. Theriac was an herbal compound originally invented as an antidote to poison, which was a smart thing to have around if you were a Roman emperor, since poisoning was practically a workplace hazard. But theriac wasn't just any antidote. It had around 60 ingredients, including cinnamon, myrrh, opium, and sometimes ground up viper flesh. That's right, snake meat as medicine. Marcus Aurelius swore by it, taking it for years. He believed it not only warded off poison, but also strengthened his constitution in general. It didn't make him immortal, but hey, he lived to 58 in the 2nd century AD, which wasn't bad by Roman imperial standards. But theriac became a whole business. Later, medieval Europeans copied the recipe and sold it as a panacea, a cure for everything. Kings in the Middle Ages had their own personal jars of theriac, which were basically Renaissance snake oil. Sometimes, literally, snake oil. Of course, not every attempt to cheat death involves swallowing poisons. Some involve bathing in unusual things. Let's gently drift over to Renaissance Hungary, where one of the most infamous women in European history, Elizabeth Bathory, allegedly tried to keep herself young by bathing in the blood of virgins. Now, historians debate how much of this is legend and how much is reality. She may have just been smeared by political rivals, but the story stuck. According to the tale, she believed blood had life-giving powers, so she used it as a kind of gothic skincare routine. If that's true, it didn't work. She ended up imprisoned in a castle tower until her death at 54. Not exactly eternal youth. And speaking of blood, Let's return briefly to ancient Rome, where gladiator blood was thought to cure epilepsy. Yes, Roman physicians prescribed drinking the warm blood of freshly killed gladiators. Crowds even collected it from the arena floor. This, apparently, was their version of a Red Bull. It didn't stop seizures, but it did make epilepsy treatment theatrical. Let's slow down and drift into the Middle Ages, because this was an era that combined superstition, faith, and just enough pseudoscience to make things really strange. One popular belief was that drinking liquid gold could extend your life. Gold was considered pure, incorruptible, eternal. So naturally, alchemists decided, why not drink it? They dissolved tiny flakes of gold into wine or medicine, and aristocrats sipped it like some kind of high-end smoothie. Of course, gold doesn't actually dissolve well, and what little did dissolve wasn't exactly bioavailable. So mostly rich people were just sipping gritty wine, which honestly sounds like a terrible party drink. And unsurprisingly, no one lived forever. But the fad stuck for centuries. Even today, luxury restaurants sprinkle edible gold flakes on food. Not because it does anything, but because people still like the idea of swallowing immortality. Another medieval method: sleep in a slaughtered animal. Yes, this happened. The belief was that if you were sick, particularly with something like leprosy or plague, sleeping inside the carcass of a freshly killed animal, like a cow or a sheep, could transfer its life energy into it. This was especially prescribed for people with wasting diseases. You'd basically crawl into the animal like some gruesome sleeping bag and hope its vitality rubbed off. Did it work? Number, did it smell? Absolutely. Imagine trying to nap in a freshly gutted sheep. Comfort level, 0. But some cures were more subtle. In medieval England, people believed carrying a dead toad around your neck in a little bag would keep you from catching the plague, which is almost cute. Imagine noblemen strutting around with tiny toad purses, thinking they were invincible. Spoiler, they weren't. And yet, even with all this strangeness, there's something very human about these attempts. The fear of death makes people grasp at anything, whether it's mercury, gold, or amphibians in a pouch. But let's not stop here, because if the Middle Ages were weird, the Renaissance was flamboyant. And nothing says flamboyant like Italian princes who thought alchemy could make them immortal. Part 2. Renaissance alchemy and the eternal life quest. So we left off with medieval eccentricities, dead toads, bloodbaths, and gold wine. Now let's glide forward a few centuries, because if anyone knew how to mix science with delusion, it was the Renaissance. Europe was bursting with curiosity, exploration, and a healthy dash of superstition. And naturally, when it came to cheating death, this period was inventive. At the heart of it was alchemy. Alchemy wasn't just about turning lead into gold, though that was a nice bonus. Alchemists promised kings, emperors, and rich merchants something even better: eternal life. They sold the elixir of life, sometimes called the philosopher's stone potion, which was said to cure illness, rejuvenate the body, and stave off death indefinitely. Of course, no one ever actually discovered it, but the recipes were spectacularly complicated. Some contained mercury, antimony, and other toxic metals. Others required exotic ingredients: powdered unicorn horn, sometimes actually narwhal tusk, crushed gemstones, or the fat of rare animals. Take Emperor Rudolph II of the Holy Roman Empire, for instance. He was a ruler who liked two things: extravagant art and even more extravagant promises of immortality. Rudolf surrounded himself with alchemists, astrologers, and dreamers, all claiming they could extend his life. He reportedly spent enormous sums on laboratories filled with bubbling flasks, strange powders, and mysterious fumes. Did it work? Not even a little. He died at 61. But at least he died surrounded by very expensive bottles of fake immortality. Meanwhile, in France, King Louis XIV, the Sun King, was obsessed with longevity too, though in a slightly more decadent way. He wasn't sipping mercury or bathing in blood, but he did enjoy medicinal concoctions and early experiments in chemistry. Physicians advised him on diets, elixirs, and life tonics, meant to keep him vigorous and handsome. Louis lived to 76, which was impressive for the 17th century, though historians are fairly sure it wasn't the powdered pearls or mysterious syrups that did the trick. Mostly he outlived his enemies and his lifestyle. And speaking of powdered pearls, oh yes, Europeans were convinced that consuming crushed gems could slow aging. Pearls, emeralds, sapphires, and even diamonds were ground into powders and mixed with wine, water, or honey. The idea, minerals were incorruptible, so if you ingested them, your body might resist decay. In practice, people spent fortunes and possibly ruined their teeth. But hey, it looked fancy at court. That counts for something, right? Let's drift a bit further east again, to Japan. The Edo period emperors and samurai weren't as obsessed with alchemy, but immortality wasn't ignored. Some noblemen consumed herbal potions made from ginseng, deer antler, and exotic roots. And then there were extreme exercises and breathing techniques designed to circulate vital energy, or QE, throughout the body. Think yoga mixed with Tai Chi, but the goal was literally, don't die. Some practitioners claimed it added decades to life. Some probably just got good at not moving too much. Back in Europe, there was another curious fad, bloodletting to avoid death. It sounds counterintuitive, because bloodletting was normally for treating illness. But some physicians argued that removing corrupted blood could purify the body and extend life. The problem? If you did it too much, or used unsanitary tools, you usually ended up shorter lived. But it remained popular for centuries because it looked medical. There's something very Renaissance about thinking, if I just drain myself enough, I'll live forever. And let's not forget the dietary approaches. From early modern England to Italy, aristocrats were obsessed with eating life-preserving foods. Water from mountain springs, rare spices, exotic fruits, and honey were all considered vital for longevity. One Italian physician actually recommended eating lettuce soaked in rose water and sprinkled with powdered gems. The idea being that the mystical properties of the flowers and stones would harmonize your body. Reality check. Lettuce is healthy, rose water is fragrant, gems are inert. But it does make for a very Instagrammable salad, if Instagram existed. Then there were the more theatrical remedies. Some emperors and dukes believed that spending nights in coffins could trick death into passing them by. They'd lie down in a coffin overnight while alchemists performed rituals, chanting and waving incense. The hope, if you confronted death in a controlled way, it might leave you alone. Most people woke up fine. A few, naturally, panicked, and none, unsurprisingly, became immortal. Finally, let's drift to one of the more tragic cases, Tsar Peter the Great of Russia. Peter admired science, invention, and European rationalism, yet even he flirted with extreme methods to extend life. He experimented with early forms of vaccination and various chemical tonics recommended by foreign physicians. He also occasionally tried life elixirs brought from Western Europe. None of it prevented him from dying at 52. But his attempts show that even the most rational, forward-thinking rulers were seduced by the promise of cheating death. And here's the gentle, ironic pattern. Whether it was a Chinese emperor sipping mercury, a French king grinding pearls, or an Italian duke sleeping in a coffin, humans have always wanted one thing: more time. Not power, not wealth, just a little more time. And every era has its own version of bizarre, expensive, or dangerous attempts to get it. Next, we'll float into the 18th and 19th centuries, where the obsession with immortality took a slightly more industrial turn. Think early modern chemistry, bizarre tonics sold in pharmacies, and the first attempts at scientific life extension. People still didn't live forever, but the methods got more complicated. Part 1. What happened to executioners after they retired? Hey guys, tonight we begin with a job nobody really wants, but everyone knew existed. The executioner. The person you never invited to dinner, whose face you might glimpse only under a hood, whose work was necessary, gruesome, and oddly ritualistic. In history, executioners were a mix of celebrity, pariah, and weirdly respected professional. But what happens when you hang up the axe, dagger, or sword? When you've cut the last head, pressed the last boot, or pulled the lever for the final time? What then? Let's float gently back to medieval Europe, where executioners were a very specific type of outcast. They performed a service everyone depended on, removing criminals, traitors, witches, and sometimes royalty from the mortal coil. But society didn't like to look at them, literally. Many executioners lived on the outskirts of towns, sometimes behind walls, and were barred from entering churches or attending certain social events. Their work made them necessary, but it also made them morally suspicious. When an executioner retired, or sometimes when they were fired, replaced, or inherited by a son, their lives became a curious mix of comfort and isolation. You see, executioners were often well paid, at least compared to peasants. They might own property, receive fees per execution, and even inherit the profession, along with its associated wealth. But their neighbors often refused to interact with them. In some towns, executioners' wives were shunned, and their children were subtly teased or outright barred from certain roles. Retirement didn't undo centuries of social stigma. Take France, for instance. In Paris, the executioner, called the bourreau, was a state official. He lived well enough during his career, sometimes acquiring property outside the city. But when he retired, he often faced a choice: stay in town and endure gossip, or move to a small village where no one knew his past. Some retired executioners bought farms, hoping to live out their days quietly, tending crops instead of heads. But centuries of fear and superstition meant that even farming neighbors might glance at him sideways. Interestingly, executioners sometimes passed on their trade like a family business. Sons or sons-in-law could inherit the position, along with its notoriety. This created curious dynasties, where every generation of a family carried both wealth and social ostracism. Retired executioners often found themselves advising the next generation. The best way to cut cleanly, the etiquette for handling condemned prisoners, and the delicate art of dealing with a public that both feared and despised you. Now let's drift a bit to England. The English chief executioners, especially during the Tudor and Stuart periods, were peculiar figures. People like Richard Brandon, who executed Charles I, earned enough to live comfortably, but their work made them unpopular with the masses. After retirement, or in Brandon's case, after surviving a career of high-profile executions, many retired to quiet towns, sometimes running pubs or inns. It was an odd combination. A man who had spent decades performing society's most feared role, now serving drinks and chatting politely with patrons. Imagine sipping ale from the very hand that once held an axe. And yet retirement wasn't always calm. Superstitions followed executioners. In some German towns, people believed that touching a retired executioner could bring bad luck, or even a curse. Legends suggested that the spirits of the condemned lingered around him, waiting for vengeance. Executioners sometimes carried amulets, charms, or even holy water to ward off these phantoms. So retirement wasn't just social isolation. It could be literal spiritual unease. Some executioners tried to reinvent themselves completely. They became merchants, blacksmiths, or farmers. But it was rarely easy. People remembered. Records and church accounts often listed them as former executioners, which could complicate business deals, marriages, or inheritances. On the other hand, a retired executioner could also enjoy certain protections. The authorities knew he had skills, and towns sometimes relied on him to train new executioners, supervise public punishments, or advise on law enforcement. And then there's the odd case of executioners who became local celebrities. In some towns in Eastern Europe, a retired executioner could live comfortably, respected for the family's service to the state, while quietly avoiding any social gatherings that required shaking hands. These individuals occupied a liminal space, both feared and admired, both shunned and necessary. It's worth noting that executioners weren't only men. There are rare but documented cases of women taking the role, especially when a husband died and the profession was inherited. Retirement for them could be even trickier. Social stigma was doubled because women were already operating outside conventional roles. Some became teachers, midwives, or local healers after leaving the block. Others simply vanished into obscurity, leaving little record. And then we have the economic side. Executioners were often paid per job, plus a small salary from local authorities. By the time they retired, they could have amassed property, savings, and sometimes even a pension. This financial cushion allowed them to live quietly, but it didn't erase the long shadow of fear and superstition. People might pay for services, but they wouldn't invite you to a wedding. You could be rich, but your social circle might be minimal. In certain towns, executioners even created their own small communities. Families rented houses together, trained apprentices in the trade, and maintained secrecy. Retirement didn't necessarily mean leaving this microcosm. It often meant scaling back duties while staying within a protective social enclave. It was a strange sort of family business, blending wealth, knowledge, and avoidance. Some executioners wrote memoirs, though rarely. These texts are fascinating because they reveal both pride in the profession and relief at retirement. They describe the awkwardness of hanging up the hood for good, the difficulty of convincing neighbors that you are no longer a threat, and the strange mixture of guilt and pride. For some, the axe never truly left their hands. It just hung silently in a corner of their home. Let's float now to another interesting point: religion. Executioners were often denied normal religious participation while active. Retired executioners sometimes tried to reconnect with faith. They sought absolution, confession, or participation in rituals they had been barred from. But many priests hesitated. After decades of taking life, the church often regarded them as morally compromised. Retirement might allow physical rest, but spiritual reintegration was slow, delicate, and sometimes impossible. And finally, let's not forget the psychological aspect. Retirement could be lonely. Executioners, after years of performing society's most feared tasks, had to adjust to quiet life. They went from public spectacle to solitude, from wielding authority to tending property, from ritualized death to daily chores. Some thrived, others sank into melancholy. The human mind isn't easily reconciled with decades of sanctioned killing, no matter how necessary it was. Part 2. Eastern European Executioners and Life After the Block. So we've covered the basics. Retired executioners often lived quietly, avoided society, and sometimes leveraged their experience to train apprentices or advise authorities. But Eastern Europe added a few twists to the story. Countries like Poland, Hungary, and the German principalities treated executioners in ways that were both practical and peculiar. In many towns, executioners became quasi-official figures, almost like civic servants, even after retirement. They sometimes held honorary titles, received pensions, or were granted small plots of land. These were usually towns that relied heavily on public executions for law enforcement and social control. Being a retired executioner there meant you were remembered, respected, and occasionally feared, even if you weren't actively swinging an axe. Yet superstition still clung tightly. In some German towns, it was believed that if a retired executioner left the area, bad luck would follow. The reasoning: executioners maintained balance between life and death. If they abandoned their town, the scales of justice would tip, and misfortune could strike. So paradoxically, staying put, quietly, at the edge of town, was considered safer for everyone. Some executioners reinvented themselves in surprising ways. Inns and taverns were a popular choice. Think about it. A retired executioner knew the human psyche, had a flair for the dramatic, and carried the mystique of someone who had stared into death countless times. Patrons were fascinated, a little wary, but ultimately willing to pay for drinks served by a person with such an unusual past. There are records of inns where the landlord's former career became a selling point. Drink at the place run by the man who once executed 30 thieves, guaranteed courage in every ale. Then there's the slightly darker twist. Some executioners' children inherited not just the trade, but the social stigma. Even if a father retired, the family name carried an almost permanent association with death. In Hungary and Poland, young men who were sons of executioners sometimes struggled to find apprenticeships, marriages, or civic roles outside the family trade. Some embraced it, continuing the family business. Others fled to distant towns, hoping anonymity would allow them a normal life. A particularly curious anecdote comes from 17th century Krakow. A retired executioner opened a bakery. Now, bread was a staple, and bakers were usually well-liked. But this baker cleverly capitalized on his past. He made a special justice loaf, small dark bread shaped vaguely like an axe. Locals bought it both for novelty and as a sort of talisman. Eating bread baked by someone who had meted out punishment was thought to ward off misfortune. It's a tiny, funny reminder that society could find ways to coexist with the memory of executioners, even if slightly obsessed with them. Religious reintegration continued to be tricky. Some executioners, especially in Catholic regions, sought penance or confession after retiring. Priests often obliged, though sometimes grudgingly. Absolution could take years, and certain sacraments might be delayed. Still, for some, this marked a peaceful period in their lives, the chance to connect spiritually after decades of performing grim duties. In smaller villages, executioners sometimes became the town's quiet problem solvers. A retired executioner knew how to negotiate with authorities, had insight into criminal behavior, and occasionally mediated disputes. Their past profession lent them an almost unspoken authority. People feared them, yes, but they also listened. Retirement didn't erase the knowledge they had accumulated. It just made it less immediately terrifying. And let's not forget the eccentricities. Some retired executioners developed hobbies that reflected their past. Collecting weapons, writing manuals on justice and punishment, or keeping elaborate records of their careers. One 18th-century German executioner, after retirement, compiled a ledger detailing every execution he had performed, the names, crimes, and fates of each prisoner. To outsiders, it looked morbid. To him, it was a historical record, perhaps a way to make sense of a life that teetered between necessity and taboo. Finally, humor, oddly enough, sometimes emerged. Stories circulated of retired executioners who played pranks, sometimes gently, sometimes darkly. In one tale from Bohemia, a retired executioner disguised himself at a festival, pretending to be a ghost of a condemned criminal. Townspeople screamed, then laughed, and he became a sort of local legend. Retirement allowed a slightly mischievous freedom, a chance to engage with society on his own terms. So to gently sum up this part, retirement for executioners was a delicate mix of isolation, opportunity, superstition, and reinvention. They were rich enough to survive, skilled enough to influence, and mysterious enough to fascinate. Yet they were often haunted, socially, spiritually, and psychologically, by a career that could never fully be escaped. Next, we can drift into part 3, exploring more about the psychological and social realities of retired executioners, plus some of the slightly absurd anecdotes about their attempts to live quietly among mortals. Part 3, Life, Isolation, and the Curious Freedom of Retired Executioners. So we've seen that executioners often retired with wealth, skill, and a reputation that lingered like a shadow. But retirement wasn't just about finances or status. It was a psychological journey, and sometimes an oddly absurd one. For centuries, executioners carried out duties that most people couldn't even imagine. Every head they removed, cleared, every rope they pulled, every lever they triggered, left an imprint on the mind. When retirement came, it wasn't as simple as hanging up the hood. Suddenly, the world was quiet. No groans from the condemned, no drumbeats of the scaffold, no whispers of fear. Just normal life. And for many, normal life was unnerving. Some retired executioners retreated further into isolation. They lived alone, sometimes with just a spouse, maybe a pet, and a small piece of land. Gardens and farms provided quiet work, but the echoes of a past filled with ritualized death lingered. Neighbors were often polite but distant. A wave or a nod might suffice. Anything more felt dangerous, because after all, you never really knew if the retired executioner had residual authority over life and death. Or maybe it was just superstition. Either way, privacy became both a comfort and a shield. Interestingly, some found the freedom exhilarating. After decades of following strict protocol, wearing hoods, and performing duties under watchful eyes, retirement allowed small rebellions. A retired executioner might dye their hair bright, wear clothing that was no longer black or gray, or start cultivating eccentric hobbies. One account from 18th century Germany describes a retired executioner who spent his days carving wooden figures, some gruesome, some whimsical, and selling them at local markets. People bought them, partly out of curiosity, partly out of respect. Art became therapy, a gentle way to reconcile with a career that society both needed and feared. Then there were the social dynamics of retired executioners' families. Children of executioners often inherited not only the trade, but also a strange social invisibility. Some retired executioners encouraged their children to leave town, pursue education, or marry outside the stigma of the family name. Others embraced the family identity fully, training apprentices, continuing minor judicial roles, or writing treatises about justice and punishment. Retirement sometimes marked a shift from physical labor to mentorship. It was a different kind of authority, quieter, but still significant. Anecdotes about retired executioners also revealed a sense of humor, dark though it may have been. In Eastern Europe, one retired executioner reportedly attended local festivals in costume, waving an axe as part of a theatrical performance. Children screamed, adults chuckled nervously, and the retired executioner basked in attention that was formerly fear-driven. It was a small, almost human rebellion against decades of social isolation. Spiritual life also played a role. Executioners, while active, were often barred from full participation in religious ceremonies. Retirement sometimes allowed them to reconnect with faith, slowly, cautiously, and occasionally ceremoniously. Confessions were taken, communion accepted, and rituals attended. Yet some priests remained wary, viewing the executioner's past as morally complicated. Even in retirement, absolution wasn't automatic. It had to be earned, or at least requested with humility. Economic realities varied. In some towns, retired executioners enjoyed substantial pensions or savings, enough to live comfortably. In others, they relied on small trades, running inns, bakeries, or shops. One fascinating story comes from Poland, where a retired executioner ran a tavern called The Last Drop, referencing both ale and the final drops of condemned criminals' lives. Patrons loved the story, and business thrived. Retirement could thus be both quiet and profitable, provided the executioner played the social game carefully. Then there were the odd legal protections. In some towns, retired executioners were exempt from minor taxes or allowed to carry small weapons for self-protection. Authorities knew their knowledge and experience were valuable, even if society was wary. This paradox, feared yet protected, was a defining feature of life after the block. Part 1. The medieval toilet situation. Hey guys, tonight we begin with something that, oddly enough, everyone did, but nobody really wants to picture too vividly. Going to the toilet in the Middle Ages. Forget knights in shining armor and damsels in distress. Most of the time, life in medieval Europe was far less noble and far more, well, smelly. So let's glide into it gently. Imagine you're living in a castle in the 13th century. Impressive stone walls, banners fluttering, the faint sound of lute music drifting from the hall, very majestic, until nature calls. Suddenly you're not a gallant knight or a courtly lady anymore. You're just a human with the same problem we all have. Where do you go? The short answer is, anywhere you could. But the long answer, which is what we're here for tonight, is far more complicated and occasionally hilarious. Castles, for instance, had what were called garderobes. Now, if you're picturing some cozy, wood-paneled bathroom, stop right there. A garderobe was basically a small stone closet built into the castle wall with a hole in the floor. That's it. You sat, you aimed, and gravity took care of the rest. The waste would drop down into a pit, or if you were lucky, directly into the moat. Because nothing says defensive architecture like turning your own sewage into a weaponized water feature. Invaders could deal with boiling oil and flying arrows, but dysentery from your castle moat, that was the real medieval flex. But before we chuckle too much, let's remember, this was considered advanced plumbing. Having a garderobe meant you were elite. Common people didn't have the luxury of their waste being neatly whisked away into a pit. They had chamber pots, and chamber pots meant, at some point, carrying your own bucket of human business outside to dump in the street. Romantic, isn't it? That's the part they always forget in the fairy tales. And yes, streets were often lined with it. Imagine walking through a medieval town, cobbled streets, tiny houses leaning against each other, the smell of bread baking. And then, oops. Someone above you just dumped a bucket out the window. That wasn't water. Medieval streets were basically obstacle courses for your shoes, which is why they wore long pointed shoes, by the way. Sure, they looked stylish, but those long toes helped you avoid stepping in the worst of it. Fashion meets function. But let's drift back to castles for a moment, because noble toilets were surprisingly quirky. Garderobes sometimes doubled as closets for storing clothes, because, get this, people thought the smell kept moths away. So yes, your fine velvet cloak might be hanging next to the Duke's favorite toilet. Nothing like a faint whiff of ammonia to remind you you're among the upper classes. Now, when it came to wiping, because yes, we have to go there, medieval people didn't exactly have rolls of Charmin Ultra Soft stacked in the corner. Depending on where you lived and how much money you had, wiping materials could include moss, hay, scraps of cloth, or just your hand, and a little water. In monasteries, monks sometimes used old manuscripts for wiping, which means that some priceless ancient texts were literally recycled. Imagine losing a work of Aristotle because Brother Thomas had a bad stomach. Speaking of monasteries, let's not forget that monks had some of the most organized bathroom systems in Europe. Monastic complexes often had long rows of latrines, with running water systems to help carry waste away. It wasn't glamorous, but it was efficient. And it tells you something when the people living under vows of poverty had better toilets than most kings. Now let's float gently to another corner of medieval hygiene. Travel. Because if you were on the road, going to the toilet was even less elegant. Inns often didn't have dedicated latrines, so you'd be lucky if there was a shared pit outside. More often, people just found a spot, which made medieval highways not only dangerous for robbers, but also hazardous for your nose. And what about women in all this? Noble ladies had their own chamber pots, sometimes decorated or made of fine metal. They'd keep them under the bed, or bring them along in carriages. There were even traveling pots, disguised as stools, so you could go discreetly while sitting in a chair. Subtle, in theory. Less subtle in practice. Because let's be honest, everyone knew what the fancy stool was for. In royal courts, of course, there was a bit more ceremony. The English kings, for example, had officials known as the Groom of the Stool. And yes, the title is exactly what it sounds like. This unlucky nobleman was responsible for assisting the king during toilet time. And here's the kicker. It was considered a prestigious job, because being near the king in such a vulnerable moment meant you were trusted. Plus, you got to hear all his private thoughts. Imagine explaining at dinner parties that your career highlight was holding the royal toilet paper. The groom of the stool system lasted well into the Tudor era, by the way. Henry VIII had them. His daughter, Elizabeth I, had them. And the position became one of the most powerful at court. Proof that proximity to the throne, even the literal smelly kind, was everything. And speaking of Henry VIII, let's not skip over him. He had elaborate palace toilets, but even he wasn't free from the occasional embarrassing detail. His enormous size and health problems meant his toilet breaks were a bit of a production, which, again, shows that being king didn't save you from the basic human condition. So to wrap this first gentle drift through medieval sanitation, the toilet situation was a mix of chamber pots, garderobes, and sheer improvisation. Sometimes practical, often disgusting, occasionally ingenious, and always a reminder that life in the Middle Ages was less about Shining's armor and more about managing the smell. Let's float next into the details of waste management. Because once you've gone, what happened next? How did entire cities handle the reality of thousands of people all using medieval toilets? Part 2, Waste in the Medieval City. So we've handled the noble garderobes, the chamber pots, and the very unfortunate groom of the stool. But what happens next? You've done your business? Congratulations. Where does it go? Because remember, this isn't a world with plumbing, sewage plants, or even reliable trash pickup. Medieval cities were living organisms, and one of their main outputs was waste. Let's start with the cesspit. If you lived in a town or city, chances are your house had a pit dug somewhere nearby where waste was dumped. Think of it as an early septic tank, except instead of neat sealed systems, these were just holes in the ground, sometimes lined with stone, sometimes not. They filled up quickly, and when they did, someone had to empty them. Enter the gong farmers, and yes, that's their real title. Gong was an Old English word for dung. Gong farmers were the medieval heroes or victims whose job it was to climb into cesspits and dig them out. Imagine spending your working life knee-deep, or often waist-deep, in other people's waste, and you thought your office job was bad. Gong farmers usually worked at night because, understandably, nobody wanted to see or smell them at work. They shoveled muck into carts, hauled it outside the city walls, and dumped it. For this, they were paid surprisingly well. But the social stigma was crushing. Nobody wanted to live near them. Nobody wanted to marry them. They were necessary, but despised. It's almost poetic. The dirtiest jobs kept medieval society going, but left their workers at the very bottom of the social heap. Now, cesspits were common in houses, but not everyone used them responsibly. People sometimes just let waste overflow into the street. And here's where city authorities had to step in. Medieval towns like London, Paris, and York actually had laws against dumping waste in the wrong places. But enforcement was tricky. Finding your neighbor for throwing slops into the alley was a noble idea, but when everyone did it, who was going to report? So, the streets ended up layered with filth. Not just human waste, but animal waste, too. Remember, animals lived right alongside people in cities. Horses, pigs, chickens. They all added their contributions, which means the average medieval street was less picturesque cobblestones and more mystery stew. And if it rained, that stew spread everywhere. If it didn't rain, it dried into a crust and released the delightful perfume. Rivers didn't help much either. The Thames in London, the Seine in Paris, and countless other waterways became open sewers. Waste flowed into them daily, and people still washed clothes, fetched water, and sometimes even drank from them. The logic seemed to be, if it's flowing, it's fine. Spoiler, it wasn't. Outbreaks of dysentery, cholera-like illnesses, and general stomach problems were rampant. But again, let's not assume medieval people were completely oblivious. They knew bad smells often made people sick. This was the miasma theory. They didn't understand germs, but they connected stink with disease, which meant cities did attempt cleaning. Officials hired street sweepers, regulated where waste could be dumped, and even fined butchers for leaving animal guts in the road. But it was always a losing battle. The sheer volume of waste was overwhelming. And then, of course, there was the night soil trade. Gong farmers didn't always just dump waste outside the walls. Sometimes they sold it. Because human waste, unpleasant as it sounds, makes pretty good fertilizer. Farmers around cities would pay for cartloads of it to spread on their fields, which means the food you ate in medieval Europe might have been grown in soil enriched by the contents of your neighbor's cesspit. Bon appétit. Let's glide for a moment to Paris, one of the largest medieval cities. By the 14th century, Paris had tens of thousands of cesspits, so many in fact, that the groundwater became contaminated. People complained their wells tasted funny. It wasn't their imagination. Water literally mingled with sewage underground, which is why wine and ale were safer to drink than water. The alcohol killed off enough bacteria to make it less risky. This wasn't just people being hedonistic. It was survival. London had the same problem. One chronicler in the 14th century complained that the stench of the Thames was unbearable. Imagine walking across London Bridge, looking down, and seeing not a sparkling river, but a churning brown soup. And then, of course, there were fishmongers still selling their catch straight from the same water. Nothing says fresh like a trout with a side of sewage. The church wasn't immune either. Monasteries, as we mentioned, had organized latrines, but when hundreds of monks used the same system, cesspits filled quickly. There are records of monks literally fleeing their cloisters because the smell of the latrine pits became unbearable. So much for divine serenity. And yet medieval people normalized it. Just like we accept traffic noise or air pollution today, they accepted foul smells as part of daily life. Sure, people grumbled about it, but it was simply the cost of living in a bustling town. If you wanted cleaner air, you moved to the countryside. And speaking of countryside, let's not forget rural sanitation. Peasants didn't have cesspits, gong farmers, or even city ordinances. They had fields, hedges, and forests. The natural world was their bathroom, which in many ways might have been fresher than city life. Until, of course, the waste seeped into streams or sat too close to homes. Rural life wasn't magically sanitary. It just smelled less concentrated. Now, a small but fascinating detail. Public toilets did exist in some cities. London, for example, had public latrines by the Thames. Essentially, rows of seats over the river, where people could relieve themselves directly into the water. Imagine sitting side by side with strangers, exchanging polite nods, while you both contributed to the current. It was communal, practical, and horrifically unsanitary. So medieval waste management was this constant balancing act between necessity, disgust, and improvisation. Cesspits, chamber pots, rivers, gong farmers, all kept the system barely functional. And through it all, people kept building bigger cities, which only made the problem worse. Let's float now to a more delicate but equally important part of the story: medieval cleanliness. Because if you're surrounded by all this filth, how did people themselves actually stay clean?